All right, we want to talk today just a little bit about a different aspect of forensic science. And we've touched on this before a little bit when we talked about crime scene analysis. But what I want to talk to you about a little bit today is the use of behavioral science in criminal investigations. And I think by this time in the semester you know that just about any discipline in forensic science, or in science rather, is applicable to the forensic arena, right? And that's the case not only with the hard and natural sciences, but also with the behavioral sciences. And the unit that I came from late in my career in the FBI dealt with behavioral matters and the application of good, sound behavioral science to a wide variety of different kinds of crimes. And we'll talk about that a little bit today. What I want to try to separate for you is the reality from the myth. And I'll waltz you through a little bit the process of behavioral analysis as we conduct it in the criminal investigative arena, and try to debunk a lot of the stuff for you that we typically see in the media. There's a big difference between what you see in media portrayals of what behavioral scientists in law enforcement do and what the actual tools and practice of our trade is. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and maybe we'll see a case or two as we go along. All right? This is where we practice our trade within the FBI and where we train a lot of state, local, county investigators in behavioral matters. This is the FBI Academy at Quantico. You've seen this picture before. And the specific group within the FBI that deals with behavioral matters is housed within an organization called the National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. And that's where we have all of our experts, psychology, psychiatry, social science, and otherwise, that bring their skills, their behavioral skills and insights to kind of practical criminal investigative problems. And the vast majority of cases we deal with are violent crime kinds of things. Right? Day in and day out, back at Quantico, when people come to us for advice, these are the kinds of problems that are on their plate. And what I hope you get a view for here, an appreciation for, is it's a rare event when someone comes to you with a simple problem. On the behavioral side, and in the laboratory as well, the things that kind of end up in our review, when people come to us for advice and input, have a tendency to be those things which are atypical. Either atypical in their violence, atypical in the way that they present themselves, or things that are rare, that other people don't have a lot of experience with, and hence they look for others who might have more experience, more insight, to get them on the right track, to help them decipher what it is they're dealing with, and then help solve the problem if that's possible. Okay? So on the behavioral side, if you want to play with us in that arena, these are the kinds of things that are going to be your bread and butter day in and day out. Serious crimes, most of them on the violent side of the house. Here is what we ask our behavioral scientists to be familiar with and cognizant of. There are a wide variety of different specialties, both in the social and behavioral sciences, as well as in pathology and other aspects of the forensic sciences. Why do we put those two together? Do you know? It's kind of a given. If you're going to be in behavioral science, you have to know something about behavior, right? That's kind of a given. Why also do we ask folks to be cognizant of and knowledgeable of other kinds of forensic things that may not be behavioral? The reason is that we see our behavior reflected in things that have happened in the past, right? Most of the time when we're dealing with the byproducts of human behavior in criminal investigations, what we're looking at are things that have occurred in the past, evidence of interactions between individuals. And we see that reflected in a wide variety of other forensic kinds of things. We see that reflected in blood spatter patterns, injury patterns, other kinds of things that kind of give us an insight and an indication of what were the behavioral interactions between the parties that were involved. So that's why we have to have our people not only be good behavioral scientists, but they have to be pretty good forensic science generalists as well. And you put those two things together, and you're able to provide your clients, the law enforcement community in the United States, with good assistance. What is it we try to do? We try to do a couple of different things. We try to make sure that our science is sound. And every time I speak to you, I try to bring this up. And we can't emphasize it enough. The forensics is an application. An application of what? It's an application, irrespective of discipline, of good, sound science. On the behavioral side of the house, we try to provide good, research-based, predictable, valid behavioral insights to criminal investigative problems. All right? So we do a lot of science. And if you're going to work with us, you need to be capable of conducting good, detailed research and be able to interpret the research that others have done and make sense out of it, weigh the pros and the cons, separate the wheat from the chaff, and be able to tell that which is predictive, that which is reliable. We do an awful lot of science. And then we try to take that science and we try to put it into products that folks who are not scientists can use. We try to translate the science into a variety of different kinds of documents, electronic and otherwise, that allow us to communicate effectively what we know to those that don't have scientific backgrounds that are doing investigations. Okay? And then we also take both of these things and we try to apply them to cases wherein there are significant questions and behavioral analysis might be helpful. All right? So that's what we try to do. And sometimes in cases, the behavioral analysis is very, very important. Other times, not so important, like every other aspect in forensic science. How do we conduct our analyses? What is the process that we go through? What is that process based on? Here is one tenet, and I think I've mentioned this to you before too, is we know that behavior is reflected in personality, right? And I think the last time I was here, I asked you to look at the person next to you. Everybody got kind of offended. But you take a look at the person next to you, or on either side of you, and what do you notice? What do you notice? There are not two of us in here that are dressed the same. There aren't two of us in here that have the same kind of haircut, that are sitting in the same posture, that are carrying the same backpacks, book bags, or whatever. We're all different. We're all different. That's our personality. And our behavior, those outward things that we can observe, are based upon the traits that we have as individuals in our personality. That's what psychologists look at. That's what psychologists look at. That's what we look at on the behavioral side when we're dealing with criminal events. We look at behavior and we try to make assessment sometimes of what that behavior means. What does it mean in terms of interactions? What does it tell us, if anything, about the offenders, the victims, the folks that were involved in whatever the act or acts is that we're looking at? All right? So behavior reflects personality. We also know that crime scenes, when we see them most of the time, either when we're at the scene or when we see them in photographic documentation, that crime scenes reflect behavior as well. And because we're unique as individuals in the way we conduct our behaviors, we also can be unique as criminals in the way we conduct criminal acts. And it's that uniqueness that allows us to apply good psychology, good psychiatry, good social science, good behavioral observation to criminal acts. Okay? All right. Those are the kinds of things we do. Here's a group of fun-loving guys. And what do you notice about these folks? Any of them look familiar to you? Yeah. Who are they? Yeah, they're all serial killers, all right? They've all killed lots of people as individuals. They all committed multiple murders in the course of their lives. That's what they have in common. Why do I have them depicted for you there in a composite of photographs?
You see that they all don't look the same?
They all don't look the same. They're like us. They all look different. They all have different personalities. They all conducted their crimes in different ways. Okay? And it's those individual behavioral traits that we can see reflected in criminal acts that allow us sometimes to make behavioral assessments and to provide important information to the investigative process. All right? The process that we go through when we deal with individual cases, when somebody either calls in on the phone or submits a package of information to us to look at behaviorally, the process that we go through is called criminal investigative analysis. And it's nothing more than the process of reviewing a case from a law enforcement behavioral perspective. And we look for behavioral insights. We look for pieces of the pie, pieces of the event that are reflected in behavior that may give some kind of an insight into what has happened and who, if anyone, is responsible. This has nothing to do with treatment, our analysis. We're not mental health professionals on this side of the house. What we try to do is do behavioral assessments that will allow us to understand what has happened in a criminal act and who may be responsible. And most of the time, what we're really trying to do is getting law enforcement investigators, the folks that are actually conducting the investigation, on the right track early on. Because in most of the events that we deal with, serious violent crimes that are often serial in nature, the clock is ticking and resources are limited. And if you can use whatever tools you have in your arsenal to allow you to understand the crime that's taken place, sometimes you can get the resources that you have that are limited on the right track in a timely fashion, and you can bring a case to a reasonable resolution. That's what we try to do with this. And the process we use is criminal investigative analysis. What do we do in these things? We try to take behavioral science, a knowledge of forensic science, good investigative experience, bring all of those things together, and conduct valuable case analyses. So again, the folks that work with us, the folks that are in the behavioral science units back at Quantico and in other law enforcement agencies, not only are they good with behavior and have good behavioral training, they also know forensic science and they also have good investigative experience. That's what it takes. If you have those things, then you can provide valuable information to a wide variety of different kinds of investigations. What are the kinds of products that people ask us for on the behavioral side of the house? I'll list a few of them here for you. Crime analyses. In the types of crimes we deal with, it's not uncommon for people to have events that are so rare or so bizarre, they've got no experience reference in dealing with those kinds of things. Because of the nature of the kinds of cases that we see day in and day out, we have that reference. So we do crime analysis. We try to explain to people what kind of crime it is that you have, what's the basis for it, who's involved, lots of things like that. Everybody hears about offender profiles. An offender profile is nothing more than an assessment and a compilation of characteristics of unknown offender or offenders, right? It's kind of the profiling thing. That in reality is less than 10% of what we do. Less than 10%. And we will do that. It takes a lot of information to do that, but we'll supply that kind of a service. There are lots of other things that go on the behavioral side of the house, however. Crime analysis is a big one. Another big one for us is linkage analysis. What's linkage analysis? Anybody know?
How to tell if two crimes are related?
Yeah, it's looking at two or more separate events, separated in time and space perhaps, and trying to figure out whether they're committed by a common offender or offenders. Are they linked together in some way? And we do those kinds of analyses, and sometimes they're difficult. They can be very challenging kinds of things to do. Other times, they're very, very easy. But the bottom line is linkage analysis is also part of what we do. Investigative suggestions, again, that kind of goes along with case analyses. An awful lot of the time, people are asking us, given the nature of this beast that we have on our plate, that we don't know what to do with, you're telling us that it's a certain kinds of case. What do we do about it? What physical evidence gives us the most bang for our buck? What kind of experts should we go after to try to help us solve this problem? Where should we put our resources? What kind of other agencies do we need to have in the mix with us to resolve the matter that's on our plate. So based on our analyses, we oftentimes will translate that into suggestions about what should be done investigatively and how to deal with those kinds of issues. Also, lots of times we have to give insights and counsel on how to talk to people. How to talk to people. What do you spend most of your time doing in law enforcement anyway? Talk to people. That's what you do. You spend an awful lot of time talking to others. On the behavioral side of the house, what we try to do is look at the personality and behavioral traits of an individual. Whether that individual is a victim, whether that individual is a perpetrator, whether the individual is a witness. And we try to do an assessment, and based on what we know about the person, we try to provide insights in how you should talk to that person in an effort to get the most reliable information and accurate information from that individual. So we do a lot of suggestions about interview and interrogation strategies for folks. How do you talk to people? And a lot of times that's the request that we get in. We do threat assessments, and I know on the behavioral side, we're always thinking about very, very violent crimes. Sometimes violent crimes haven't occurred yet. Sometimes they come from people who suggest in advance that they're going to commit certain types of things, either to groups of people or individuals. We call those threats, right? On the behavioral side of the house, as a behavioral science in criminology, you may be asked, and we're frequently asked, to look at threats and try to decide from research, experience, the details of the threat, whether it's against an individual, a group, an entire nation, and decide what is the seriousness of that threat. How likely is the individual or individuals that have issued the warning, made the suggestion that they're going to do something, how likely is it that they're going to follow through? All right. What's the threat level? So you'll be asked to conduct those kinds of things as well. Interesting stuff. And then we assist prosecutors in presenting cases to courts, because in essence, if you're going to present a case to a court, who are you really presenting the case to? Jury of your peers, right? To people, to groups of people. And in order to be effective, you have to be able to communicate effectively with others. And sometimes we make suggestions about that. Every once in a while, we will supply expert testimony. And a lot of the behavioral expert testimony that you will get involved in if you work in this arena involves communicating to groups of people about what's the nature of the crime. What's the crime like? What's it all about? Why does it occur? Those kinds of things, all right? You're kind of an educator of the folks that are involved in the prosecutive process. So what do we try to do? We try to provide a better understanding of the offense, including a whole variety of things that you see listed there, including motivation, victim selection processes, crime scene dynamics. We try to focus the investigation. In every major crime that comes across a law enforcement agency's plate, doesn't matter how big that law enforcement agency is, you don't have enough people. You don't have enough resources. Resources are always limited for us. We try to focus the investigation in the most probable direction. Based on what? Based on good experience, based on good academic knowledge, based on good research. The ability to be predictive and accurate in what you say is important here. And that's why we try to bring very good science to the behavioral science arena. And then we provide advice regarding investigative techniques that may lead to the timely resolution of the matter. All right? Okay. Criminal investigative analysis, again, is a comparison of case information, and we couple that with a knowledge of normal and abnormal human behavior and good experience and research information that deals with the kinds of crimes that are most typical. And again, a lot of those things are either serial in nature, or they're atypically violent or bizarre. They're outside of the frame of reference of investigators that are dealing with these things. Here's just a list for you of the kind of information that you need to have if you're going to analyze one of these cases from a behavioral perspective. It's not something that you do off the cuff. even though we see that a lot in the media, I think, these days. We solve everything in 15 minutes on TV. That's not what happens here. What are the three most important things in behavioral science? Three most important things.
Experience, science, and behavioral science.
Pretty close. What are the three most important things in medicine? History, history, history. The three most important things in behavioral science when you're doing criminal investigative analysis. You're applying behavioral science to criminal problems, to crime events. History, history, history. The more history you have, the more information you have about what took place and how it occurred, the better off you are in being predictive in the analysis of the behaviors that are reflected there. And you can see that most of the information that I have listed here for you deals with historical kinds of things. Autopsy reports, photographs, maps and diagrams of areas, crime scene reports, initial responding officer reports, detailed history of the individual or individuals that became victims, all of those kinds of things. They paint a very good picture for you that allows you to put things together and come up with good assessments. And here's how it goes. We take all of that information, we lump it together, and as behavioral scientists, we try to wrap our behavioral arms around it and then come up with an analysis that's beneficial to who? Beneficial to the folks that are trying to resolve the crime. And that's what we try to do, okay? Let's talk about some of the things that we look at here quickly, all right? We look at things that deal with the victim. We call it victimology. And here's a long list for you of victimology-related kind of topics, bits and pieces of information that we want to try to have when we're assessing a crime from a criminal investigative perspective. We want to know about lifestyle, personality, families and friends, marital status, on and on and on and on and on here. What is this called? It's called detailed victim history. That's what it's called. Why are we interested in this? Why are we interested in this? Yeah, we know that victims of crime oftentimes are selected by the offenders. Offenders choose particular individuals from the entire population of available victims that are around, right? Sometimes a good detailed history of a victim will give us some insights into how it was and perhaps why it was that that particular individual became a victim as opposed to other individuals, okay? Victim history is important to us. And we could talk an awful lot about routine activities theory and some other kinds of things that would give you more insight into victim selection processes. The bottom line is we got to know a lot about the victim, okay? We look at offender risk level, and we look at the kinds of risks that the offender, he or she, exposed themselves to in the commission of the crime. Is it a high-risk crime? Is it a low-risk crime? Okay. Sometimes when you make those kinds of assessments, it gives you some insights into what the offender is like, what their personality is like, and what kinds of things they are likely to do in the future. We try to look at crime scene characteristics. And the two big ones that you'll hear about, the big dichotomy, is organized and disorganized, okay? There are organized crimes and there are disorganized crimes. And actually, this is a big continuum. Rarely do you find one on either end of the pole. It's a big continuum from organized to disorganized. What's that all about? Do you know where that came from? Organized and disorganized came up as terms years and years ago when behavioral science was first being brought to the criminal investigative arena, largely because in applying good behavioral science to crimes, you have to communicate to people that are not psychiatrists, psychologists, that are not clinicians, right? So instead of using kind of $5 medical terms from psychiatry and psychology, those terms were modified and put into terms that were more easily understandable by law enforcement officers and others that are investigating crimes. What's a disorganized crime? Have you had any psychology? Any folks in here taking a psychology course? Yeah, there are lots of characteristics, including spontaneity, disorganization, all kinds of things that fall under the disorganized umbrella. The medical term that it was derived from, the clinical term, was schizophrenic. All right? People were coming to terms with how to communicate effectively what schizophrenic types of personalities in their acts really kind of did. And so they came up with disorganized. How about organized? What, you know what organized is derived from? Yeah, pretty close. The term we use in clinical psychology is psychopathic. Psychopathic people, very detail-oriented, planning, all kinds of characteristics we could list. The bottom line is those were the two ends of the spectrum. Schizophrenic type behaviors, psychopathic type behaviors. And that's what was trying to be communicated. And instead of saying that, they just used organized and disorganized. Who's this guy here? Yeah, Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy. Organized guy or disorganized guy? Yeah, and what does that mean? Premeditation and planning, minimum risk, evidence conscious, all kinds of things like that, all right? All kinds of things that reflect a very organized, planned, premeditated, not only kind of crime characteristic, but personality, all right? Let me show you a disorganized person. Who's this fellow? Ed Gein. This is Ed's house in his barn. Both he and Mr. Bundy were serial offenders, right? They killed multiple individuals in the course of their criminal history. But take a look at Mr. Bundy and take a look at Mr. Gein, and just looking at a photograph of them, you can tell they're different. Does he look like an organized guy? No. How about his house? Yeah. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to kind of figure out that there's a dichotomy between these two types of people, even though they're committing multiple murders, right? And we can analyze, characterize kind of their personality types and the behaviors that those personality types are reflected in. We can make lists of things, and that's how we come up with the organized, disorganized dichotomy. And the characteristics, the general characteristics are listed there for you, okay? It's organized and disorganized. So we consider that when we're dealing with these cases, as well as victimology. There are some other concepts that we have on the behavioral side of the house when we look at the scenes of crimes and events that have occurred in the past. One is staging. What is staging? It's kind of depicted for you here.
Set up.
Yeah, it's set up. That's a good way to phrase it. We see scenes sometimes that are configured by the offender to look like something they're not, to get you off the track. In this particular house, there was a murder was committed here. There's a deceased lady that's in the house here. And what is that scene staged to look like? And well, it's staged to make it look like a residential burglary. What's the problem with this? It's too neat. That's right, it's too neat. Whoever set this up just has never committed a burglary before. And the idea is good, the practical application is a bit lacking. But what you see is these drawers are kind of pulled out a uniform way. All the pictures, all lined up on the dresser, all the clothes still in the closet, but the door's open. Every once in a while there'll be a few things scattered on the floor. Not much of value is missing, okay? Give you an idea what's going on here. Somebody's trying to make you think that something occurred that has not occurred. And their frame of reference is just not very accurate. We call that staging. How about undoing? What happens in undoing? This is kind of an undoing thing here.
It's like wiping friends?
Not so much that, no. It has more to do with the mindset of the offender, not with physical evidence.
Trying to cover up what they did kind of in their mind, like you didn't apparently want to look at what it is.
Right.
They covered it in their mind.
You know, in the midst of this horrendous act here, there's a kind of an act of kindness. Yeah. We call that undoing. And sometimes that tells us something about the relationship between the victim and the offender. Sometimes it tells us something simply about the mindset of the offender. Okay? But we call that undoing. And depersonalization is kind of depicted for you here, although I try to keep the photographs from being very graphic. Depersonalization, we have a lady on a bed here, victim of a very violent crime. Lots of blood, lots of things around. You'll notice that there's a pillow over her head. The offender put a pillow over her head so he didn't have to look at her face. Okay? Depersonalize the act a little bit. Right? And you can read about all of these things in more detail. We don't have a lot of time today. What's overkill?
Stabbed 57 times.
Yeah, the mechanics of the homicide often far exceed what's necessary. You see people, like you suggest, stabbed 200 times, or beaten over the head with a lamp 50 times. All kinds of the back of the car over them 10 times. All kinds of things that go way beyond what's necessary. We call that overkill. And sometimes we see that. And again, that tells us something about, sometimes, the relationship between the victim and the offender, or the mindset of the offender at the time of the offense. All right? Okay. All kinds of stuff like that we look at. Signature versus modus operandi. Two concepts that we also deal with on the behavioral side. Are you familiar what these are? What's MO? What's modus operandi?
It's what they do to every single person, or like they hide them in a certain place. But a signature would be like something they took from the body.
You're close. You're very close here. MO, modus operandi, is basically that set of actions that are required to commit the crime. It's what it takes to commit the crime. And we see sometimes the modus operandi of individuals evolve and change over time. Why? You get experience. And as you get experience, it takes sometimes less and less to commit the same kind of act. You get better at doing it. So we see changes in that a little bit. But MO is basically what it takes to commit the crime, the behaviors that we see reflected in the acts that are necessary to commit the crime. And that can change with time as people get better and better at doing what they do. How about signature? What's signature? And I've got a kind of an example for you here. I think I've got a note on the next page. You can see that this is a single victim homicide. There are actually a series of these, all that had kind of the same underlying characteristic. What's signature? Yeah. Signature is exactly that. It has a tendency to be consistent behaviors. Lots of times they satisfy kind of a psychosexual need, and they go beyond what's necessary to commit the crime. This lady's a strangulation death, and there are several of these victims, and I'll show you a note in a minute, I think. But you'll notice that in addition to being strangled, these are marks on her buttocks here, bruises, contusions, from a belt. She's been whipped with a belt repeatedly. Now, given that this is a sexual assault case, doesn't take whipping with a belt to dispatch this lady. Doesn't take whipping with a belt here to commit a sexual assault. What's going on here with the belt whipping thing?
Sexual gratification.
Yeah, it's a gratification thing. It's a behavior that we see kind of reflected in the actions of the offender that goes beyond what's necessary to commit the crime, and which meets some other kind of a desire or need on the part of the offender. And here the linkage between a whole series of cases was what? Was the individual's signature, which was his focus on beating women with a belt or other kind of object. All right? So that's the difference between signature and MO. And sometimes with signatures, there'll be something will be left behind. Something will be done to the individual in a certain way that means something to the offender. Where do we see it reflected? Sometimes you don't know its significance until you talk to the offender, because the significance is to him or her. The bottom line is we see it consistently happen between scenes, and it goes well beyond what's necessary for the commission of the act. And in fact, it often requires more time with the victim, which increases the risk level to the offender. All right? That's signature versus MO, which is simply getting the job done, what it takes to get the job done.
These notes, are they from something you left? Or?
He was sending notes to several of the victims. Right? And in those notes, what do you see reflected? A focus on what's important to that person. That same kind of focus is reflected in what's done to some of the victims. Okay? That's called a signature. We also look at methods of body disposal. And bodies can be dumped, they can be concealed, they can be displayed. There are a whole variety of different ways in which remains can be handled after death. And we look at those. Why?
Could be someone's signature.
Yeah, or a reflection of the person's personality too, right? The way somebody disposes of remains after an act may tell us something about their relationship to a victim or something about their personality traits that allows us to get the investigation on the right track. You can be dumped, you can be concealed, you can be displayed. This is a person who's dumped. What does that mean? Yeah, just haphazardly cast aside like so much trash. All right? The offender shows little concern about where the body's found, when it's found, who it's found by. Doesn't matter. How about somebody that's concealed? Here's a concealed case. Takes effort to do that, right? Cover the person up with brush. You got to cut the brush, or you got to gather it together, put it on top of the person. Sometimes people bury people, hide them in boxes, all kinds of things like that. Takes kind of active involvement of the offender here to conceal a person. Something different going on here than here, right? Okay. All right. How about displayed? What's displayed? Right. The individual positions the victim to maximize the shock value of whoever comes across those remains first. And it can be pretty dramatic, which is why I don't have a photograph here for you to see. But the bottom line for you guys is that there are differences not only in the way crimes are committed, but how remains are disposed of that can give us insights into the personality, the behavior, the characteristics of the offender.
In your experience, is dumped and concealed a lot more common than displayed?
Yes, much, much more common. Much, much more common. All right. Somebody mentioned trophies here, or the taking away of personal items. We see trophies taken every once in a while, particularly in serial offense cases. We'll see items of jewelry, other things of, that belong to a victim or victims are removed and disappear from the scene. What's going on here? Enables the offender to relive the crime. They take something of a physical nature that allows them to relive what it is they've done. And here's a piece of jewelry that was taken from a victim. This is the offender. Where was that jewelry found? Gave it to his significant other. All right. Gave it to his significant other. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Folks that do that tells us something about what's going on with them. Right? All right. We look at geographic factors. We look at temporal factors. We know that geography, where things occur, when they occur, can give us insights into what's going on with the offender in terms of perhaps where they live, perhaps where they work, whether or not they work, what times during the day they can be unaccounted for, all kinds of things like that. So we do temporal analyses and we do geographic analyses. Do you know where, what kind of cases the original geographic profiling, geographic analyses were done on, where they started? It's kind of interesting forensic trivia for you. Arson cases. Arson cases were the original. And then it kind of progressed into serial rape cases. But on the geographic side, in the original arson cases, when there were serial arsonists working in an area, it was discovered that if you plotted the locations in sequence of the events that occurred, you could essentially develop a pattern of home range. You could look at the comfort zone of the offender and then predict where the offender either worked, resided, or had significant ties based on the geographic pattern that developed. So we look at those things as well. The bottom line is, as I mentioned to you before, we try to look at the totality of circumstances. We try to look at all aspects, the entire history of the crime or crimes that we get our hands on, and then we try to bring good behavioral information to that understanding. We've got a few more minutes. Let's look at a case and see if we can have a discussion of behavior a little bit. Here's the history with the case for you. It's a 12-year-old female. She was abducted from her residence. You see it here at night. Was having a slumber party with two friends and disappeared from her house. Offender comes into the house, takes one little girl out, 12 years old. The other two girls are left there. They are bound and blindfolded with things from the house. And it's interesting that the little girl's mom and her stepsister were sleeping in nearby rooms. Okay? That's the call that comes in for you. That's the case that's on your plate. All right? What do the investigators want to know? What's going on here? What kind of offender am I dealing with? And how am I going to get the little girl back? All right. What are you going to tell them? There's a photograph of the house and its surroundings. Sometimes pictures are worth 1,000 words in these kinds of analyses because it gives you an idea of the crime in context. Okay? Take a look at that for a minute, see what's there. Here's a couple of composite drawings that were done by the victims that were not taken. 3 little girls in the room playing board games, 10:30 at night. Individual comes into the house, takes one, binds the other two, leaves. Okay. Here's kind of the composite photographs, some commonalities here. Look at that for a minute and start to think about what it is we're dealing with. Here's a photograph of the room. Shows you what's there. What the context is. If you look at some of these and other photographs, or you go to the scene, you will see evidence of behaviors between the girls that are there, common behaviors, and then behaviors that reflect the intervention of the offender here. And what are we trying to do? What are we trying to do in this case? We're trying to decide what kind of a crime have we got, right? It's a missing 12-year-old girl. What kind of an animal is this? What kind of a crime is it, given all the types of crimes that could be taking place? And then what, if anything, can we glean from our behavioral expertise about the person that committed this crime? What does that tell us about him and his history, other kinds of things? What behaviors does the offender display here? Yeah, kind of organized, right? A little bit, you'd be towards that end of the spectrum, a little. Goes into an occupied dwelling at night. Tells you something about what his comfort level is, the kind of risks that the person is willing to take, perhaps what they are comfortable doing, perhaps what that reflects what they've done in the past, those kinds of things, right? Threatened with a knife, brought a weapon with him, had a weapon with him when he came, tells you something. Bound him up, took the one little girl away. Okay? This case turns into a homicide case, and this is the recovery site for the remains of the little person. Again, we see behaviors reflected here, do we not? We see behaviors reflected in not only abduction sites, but assault sites, body disposal sites, but also can give us insights into the characteristics of the offender. Here are some characteristics that we're interested in. Do you think we're dealing with a male or a female? Why? Females aren't going to go around taking 12-year-old girls? How do you know that?
Because the History.
History.
Wanting
Yeah.
anything to do with the 12-year-old was highly unlikely.
Yeah, I heard the term right here. The point I try to make, and we don't have a lot of time to finish this stuff up, but we will sit as a group, and you can do this with any group, and we will wax eloquent for hours about what we think here. When sometimes you can get into pretty good heated discussions over male, female. What's the age of the offender? What's the motive here, or the intent? What kind of lifestyle does the person have? What's their employment history? Were they married? Were they not? What kind of car did they drive? They have a lot of money? They high on the socioeconomic scale? Are they not? They have a criminal history? Do they not? We can wax eloquent about this stuff forever, and we all have very strong opinions. What you have to have in these kinds of scenarios and other scenarios where your opinion matters, where people are going to act on what you say, is you have to have something to back it up. I always tell folks, opinions are like armpits. We all got them, and they mostly stink. What do we back up our opinion with here? Research. We have to have good research that tells us what, in similar cases in the past, have been the commonalities that have been shown to be true and reliably true. So we can study this stuff, can we not? And we do big studies of epidemiology of crimes that allow us to be predictive. What else do we need to back up our opinion with here? Investigative experience. If you've never investigated one of these cases or been involved with them, they're a foreign animal. And you don't have the same kinds of insights into what takes place, how these cases are resolved, as perhaps someone that's just done research does. So we put investigative experience together with research, and hopefully we come up with good stuff. We think this is a guy? Yeah, okay, it is. What age range? 30s? Why in his 30s and not his teens?
That's usually what the facts are.
12-year-old girls and
That's
all.
usually what it is.
He's past his prime? That's the first time I've heard that. That's pretty good, yeah.
He's got to have enough strength to pick up a 12-year-old girl and get out of the house.
Yeah, he has to be physically able to do what he does, right? He's got to be physically able to control 3 people that are not 2 years old. They're 12, 13 years old, all right? And he's able to get in and out of a residence where mom and another sister are sleeping undetected, even committing this kind of stuff. And he's in a neighborhood where the houses aren't 5 miles apart. You looked at the picture, they're all together. We go kind of to the older extreme of the criminally active age range of people based on what we think is criminal sophistication and experience. So we're on the late 20s, early to mid 30s kind of thing as well with this. What's the intent of the offender? What's the motive? What's the offender want here? What do you go in that house for? For what? Yeah, it's a sex case, right? We think it's a sex case. How do we know that? The same kinds of things we've talked about. Do you see where we're going with this? Do you see where we're going with this? And we don't have time to go through the whole thing today. This is just one example of an endless number. But what we wanted to share with you is just how we can take not only good disciplines in the hardcore forensic sciences, but we can take valuable information and insights from the social sciences as well and apply them to criminal events and add pieces to the puzzle that allow folks to solve these things in a timely way and to manage their resources in an effective way, that kind of thing. Anybody have any questions about this? All right, if not, I hope you have a little better appreciation for what we do on the behavioral side. Have a great day.
Thank you.